Hi, my name is Courtney. This is my first YouTube video. This is my cat Engine. She's extremely, extremely clingy. Hi. Um, so I wanted to talk today about uh, The Unreal and the Real by Ursula Le Guin. Hi, Engine. Alright, how about you hop off? There you go. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about The Unreal and the Real by Ursula Le Guin. So this is a collection of short stories by Ursula Le Guin, who unfortunately passed away, I think it was a couple of years ago. So her collection of short stories. This collection of short stories is split in two. There's two sections. The first half is stories that are based on Earth, or at least something similar to Earth, maybe an alternative Earth where things don't work quite the way that they do, but things are recognizable. The people involved are humans. There are places that we know of, things like the UK and America and countries and things like that exist. They maybe just don't quite work the same. I think there's one story where which is based in a town in the US, which moves around. So it just kind of, it's, some days it's on this side of the country, some days it's on the other side of the country, but it is still on Earth. It just doesn't work the same. And then the second half of the book is probably more familiar territory for most people who've read some of Ursula Le Guin. So it's science fiction, but if you know anything about Ursula Le Guin, she feels a little strongly about the term science fiction, but it would be recognized as such for most people. So this is based off-world, in the future, on other planets. There are aliens, and most of the stories are based in the Hainish world. So a lot of Ursula's stories, off-world stories, are based in a universe that she calls Hainish, where there's kind of this like galactic civilization made up of a bunch of different people, but I think the center of that group of worlds is Hain, and you can I think it's open to interpretation, sort of what the nature of that civilization is. Is it a group of allies? Is it an empire? I think it's a little open to interpretation, and I think she does that deliberately, which I quite like. Which kind of one of the first stories in that section was called Semley's Necklace, which I quite liked. It looks at things from the perspective of somebody who is on one of the worlds, who is being observed by this civilization, and how it looks from their perspective. And from their perspective, they're being dominated. They have been conquered, and are still in the process of being conquered. Whereas you see things from the perspective of the Hainish, and like they just think that they're to observe, like they're just sort of collecting objects for the museum, for the sake of their scientific collections. It's interesting. To be clear, I haven't actually completely finished the book. I'm this far through it, volume-wise, but story-wise, I think I'm about halfway through the science fiction section. The first one in the science fiction section is probably Le Guin's most well-known story, which is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which was the first story of hers that I read. I read that on the internet, not in a book. I read it just some like PDF that I managed to find from somewhere. This would have been when I was about 15, 16, and it stuck with me all that time. I've read a lot of random PDFs from the internet in my time, and that one always stuck with me. And so when I started reading a little bit more actively in the last 5 years or so, and Le Guin kind of came up as as an author to, as an option to read, I was really excited because I was like, oh, that's the one who wrote that Omelas story. Oh, that's great. And so I read, I think I read the Left Hand of Darkness. I read The Dispossessed, which really stuck with me. I also read the Earthsea series, which was lovely. Like I wish that I'd read that when I was younger, because it's just a beautiful world. But there is something about Le Guin's writing that I do want to talk about. Like I love Le Guin, but there is a pattern that I've noticed to her writing, which is that I think she sometimes gets very occupied by the big ideas. Like she has a really high level abstract concept or even feeling that she kind of wants to convey. And I think sometimes she sort of forgets the other elements of the story. And it usually happens once things are established. And so I haven't noticed this quite as much in most of her short stories, because they tend to be they're very punchy, like they get to the point, whereas I did notice that towards the end of the Earthsea series, instead of, sort of writing about these characters or their stories or the plot or even the world, she was very focused on kind of mythos building, like not world building in the sense of these are the places, this is what they look like, this is how they feel, this is how people interact with each other, but world building in the sense of building a mythology. And it felt very much like everything else in the story was suddenly paying tribute to this other goal that she had. And I noticed that probably in the last two books. That said, Tahanu, the fourth book, is absolutely my favorite of the series. So yeah, I wanted to talk about this tendency that I've observed in Le Guin, and how up until now I hadn't really observed it in her short stories, but I think that I can also see it again in her real world section of the story. And it was actually much more of a grind to get through the first half of this book than it normally is for any of Le Guin's writing for me. So I found that quite interesting as well. I felt like with a lot of the real world based stories, I felt like she had this idea in her head of what she wanted to convey, but she didn't quite put it in the page. And so sometimes I would be spending this time where what I think she wants me to be doing is absorbing the world and the people and the characters and just the overall like feeling of the landscape, when what I'm actually trying to do is figure out the family tree. Like sometimes it seems like people are siblings, but then it turns out one of them is somebody else's mother, and that's really confusing. And I think if there's one criticism of Ursula Le Guin's sort of real world writing that I have, it's this. It's that she doesn't focus enough on conveying the information that the audience needs, that I, the reader, need in order to understand the thing that she actually cares about, because it's quite distracting. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Like a lot of the stories in here very much convey that, like very much kind of encapsulate that flaw for me, and so I found that really interesting. Like I think it was Brothers and Sisters was quite difficult. Hand Cup Shell, that was I could feel that there was so much like history and like family history in that, but I just couldn't figure out who anybody was or how they related to each other, or who the sort of protagonist of that bit was. And I think this part was actually deliberate, but given all of the other confusion, it didn't quite land the way that it should, which was that she would switch perspectives between the characters. So there's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, and she would kind of switch perspectives between them. And so, that happened kind of fluidly, where the person who was the I, or was the protagonist of the story, where the narration was from their perspective, it changed, and I loved that idea. It just with the rest of the confusion, and by that point, this was kind of towards the end of the first half as well. So I was sort of like, oh, this again. And yet there are some aspects of her real life stories that I really love, um, particularly the multi generational stories. If she conveys who is in which generation. Um, so this book here, Unreal and the Real, is part of a two parts series that I've got. I've kind of got a box set, and the other one is Lost, the Found and the Lost. Um, and in this one, there's also another one of her real life. This one isn't separated. This one's novellas. Um, I think it was Hernes. I think that's how you pronounce it. Hernes. And that was about multi generations of women in a family, and that was brilliant. And that even skipped back and forth between the stories of the different generations, and it took a little bit of concentration to figure out who was who, but it didn't take me out of the story. Doing that mental work. Whereas I think with a lot of the other ones in Unreal and the Real, it did. Yeah. What else do I want to say? I do find it quite difficult navigating Le Guin's writing because there's frequently stories that are in multiple ones of her collections, and I also find it quite difficult figuring out which are in the same universe as well. I kind of just assume that all of the science fiction ones are in the Hainish world, unless proven otherwise. Um, Cool. So I think that's probably all I've got to say about Unreal and the Real, at least for now. Um, I love Le Guin's work. There are a few of her books that I still haven't read, and a lot of them are still sitting on the shelf waiting for me. Um, I do absolutely adore her work, and I love that she was one of the pioneers of, I guess, what's termed soft sci-fi. Um, in that she creates these sort of fantastical worlds, and that's not really the point. The point is like how does the situation affect things? Like what does a different society look like because it happens to be on a different planet? And there are so many themes from other genres that she employs as well. Like, so this goes back to kind of what she often says about science fiction, where like technically I suppose she's a science fiction writer, but she often employs work from other genres. So for example, Semley's Necklace, um, it lives in it's in the planet that it's based on, is kind of a feudalistic, but it's like a fantasy kind of feudalism. So it's the genre of the story, if you just take it at face value, is actually fantasy. It's a quest basically. So a princess wants to go and find her necklace. I think it's a queen actually. A queen wants to go and find her necklace, which belongs to her family, and it was taken. And that sort of like effortless blending of genre and not like kind of just complete apathy towards the idea of genre in general, is something that's really characteristic of Le Guin's writing, and something I really admire and I respect her for. Um, yeah, I think that's everything that I've got to say.